Boss battles. They're a staple in almost all video games, and the Crash Bandicoot franchise is no exception. There's been a lot of boss fights throughout the series' long history, with plenty of great ones, and plenty of not so great ones. But which of these fights stand tall above the rest, and which ones wallow among the worst? That's what I want to find out today by ranking every boss fight in the series. Well, almost every boss fight. I've chosen to leave bosses from spin-off titles out of the mix, so no boss races from Crash Team Racing or Crash Nitro Kart, and no boss battles from Crash Bash or Crash Purple. I think the way these bosses work is different enough from bosses in the main series where it's simply not fair to compare them. I suppose I could have left Bash and Purple in the mix, since some bosses from those games do function similarly to the main series bosses, but there were also some that didn't follow the same structure, and it kinda just felt weird to include a spin-off game anyway, so I felt like it was better to just leave them out entirely. I'm also not going to include any bosses from Crash of the Titans or Mind Over Mutant. While these technically are main series games, they're so far removed from the rest of the series in terms of gameplay and design, and this includes the way bosses are approached, that it still didn't feel like a fair comparison. So as much as I'd love to dunk on Titan's Uka Uka and how much of a dog water fight that is, those games' fights will not be ranked either. And finally, I'll be treating the boss fights in the Insane trilogy as the same thing as their PS1 counterparts. While they aren't strictly identical, they are similar enough to the point that I don't really feel like they need separate rankings. I don't have any rigid methodology as to how I'm tackling my opinion on each fight, although things I'm keeping in mind are general challenge in relation to where in the game the fight takes place, overall design, and whether or not the fight is interesting and fair, as well as general tone and atmosphere set by the fight. But I wouldn't expect 100% consistency in these thoughts, it's a complicated topic. I'm also not going to factor in any cheese strats as points for or against a fight's quality, because those aren't symptoms of game design, rather oversights that the developers clearly didn't intend when making them. And as must always be stated, this is simply my opinion and should not be taken as fact. Feel free to disagree with anything I say in this video, but for everyone's sanity, try not to take it personally. And with that, we have 45 boss fights across 8 games to rank. Let's start off with the worst of the bunch.
There's my ride!
There's bad final boss fights in video games, and then there's Cortex in Crash 2. I feel like this transcends simply being the worst fight in the entire Crash series. This has to be one of the worst boss fights of all time. Can we even call it a fight? Because no fighting actually occurs. All Cortex does is look straight at you and fly away when you get close, and after taking 3 spin attacks, that's it. The fight, and by extension the game, is just over. You can genuinely beat this boss fight in less than 25 seconds. I'm not even kidding. The average split time for this fight in a Crash 2 speedrun is 40 seconds, and 18 of that is the time it takes entering the fight. And what makes it even worse is that this is the final boss. It would be laughably pathetic as the first boss in the game, but as the final boss? I don't pretend to be a master historian on the entire medium of video games, but the only other final boss I can think of that's as quick and effortless as Cortex in this game is Ganon in the Zelda CDI games. Yeah, there was no question here. Crash 2's Cortex fight was easily going to bottom out this list, but the good news is that it can only go up from here. Right? Oh! If there's any recurring villain in the Crash series that consistently has amazing boss fights, it's gotta be Engine. With that said, whenever I get to his boss fight in Twinsanity, I have to ask myself, what the hell happened here? This fight is so far removed from every other fight with Engine to ever exist. There's no gigantic mech that you have to destroy all while dodging an endless barrage of missiles and lasers. No, all you do is run around this floating ring in the sky, I guess? All while Engine stands in the center launching missiles and throwing TNTs at you. And the way you win this fight is by baiting him to throw a TNT at the 3 support beams so he destroys them. Yeah, this fight lacks any of the depth and franticness that is omnipresent in every other fight with him in the series. Instead, we're treated to a very bog standard, dodge the attacks and hit the boss 3 times fight that the Crash series is a bit too overzealous in using in my opinion. I suppose this fight gets some bonus points for not technically being one where you wait for an opening and strike Engine while he's down, and it does have elements of baiting your enemy that some of the better fights in the series have, but the reason I have this fight solo is that I just expect so much more from a boss fight with Engine. This one is just so drab in comparison, with even the song not really playing up the grandioseness that I've come to associate with an Engine boss fight. The fight itself is extremely random too, not random in the sense that it's RNG, but random in the sense that it happens right in the middle of one of the longest levels in the entire game. I also feel like this boss fight and the one immediately after it are a pretty noticeable drop in quality compared to the 3 fights in Twinsanity that precede it, which also does it no favors. Speaking of which...
Poor frogs.
I find it oddly amusing that despite Dr. Entropy often being portrayed as by far the most competent of the evil scientists and one of Crash's most dangerous foes, his track record in terms of quality boss fights is honestly less than stellar. His joint boss fight alongside Embryo in Twinsanity is no different, and in my opinion it's his worst outing in the series. Much like the Engine boss fight immediately preceding it, the fight just happens completely out of nowhere. Except in the case of Entropy and Brio, it makes even less sense because at least Engine was the owner of the battleship you just raided. These two guys are literally just here, demanding you give them the evil twins' treasure that they just magically happened to know about. I realized that there was a deleted cutscene that would have explained how Entropy knew about the treasure, but the fact of the matter is that within the game itself, there is simply no context to this. The fight itself is also extremely mediocre, consisting of a phase where Embryo takes the form of a giant frog monster? You simply have to dodge him trying to jump on you like it's an audition for WWE. Once that's over, Entropy drops down from the heavens in a T-pose in order to assert his dominance, puts up a shield, and proceeds to smack the ice with his tuning fork. This dude straight up has the ability to create fireballs and lasers that literally disintegrate Crash on contact, but instead he resorts to playing the worst game of whack-a-mole I've ever seen, and I played Spyro 3. This fight just reeks of being rushed and thrown together at the last second, which is honestly just a recurring story for both Twin Sanity and Entropy boss fights. I'm not entirely sure why I have this one spot over Engine, since contextually the former makes far more sense, but I suppose that although this boss fight is also pathetically easy, there is the possibility of messing up your movement on the sinking platforms and dying, whereas with Engine there's no genuine threat. Even if you have to redo certain phases if you miss destroying one of the support beams, none of his attacks are actually scary enough where you should ever realistically die to them. Honestly, these fights could share a spot and be tied since they're so close together in-game that I almost forget that they're two separate fights. Like actually, when I was making this list, I got to the end and had 44 fights and was thinking to myself, that's not right, I know there's 45, only to realize that I had forgotten to put Engine on the list, which I guess makes it the more forgettable of the two. I try not to be too harsh on first bosses when making this list, since they're supposed to be easy, but I do still think it's important for a boss fight to not be boring, and Ripperoo in Crash 2 is, unfortunately, quite boring. I obviously don't really expect this fight to be hard, but at the same time, it's absolutely devoid of any real challenge, with Ripperoo doing the exact same thing every time in terms of the patterns in which he sets up the TNTs and Nitros. I could see this fight potentially tripping up a newcomer who's unaware of what exactly each pattern looks like, but once you've cleared that one instance of the unknown, I truly don't expect anybody to have difficulty with this fight whatsoever unless they're under the age of 5 or their name is XQC. This is especially compounded by the fact that there's no way to speed this fight up, which is like, whatever, a lot of the boss fights in the series are auto-scrollers, but even the ones that are usually require some form of committed action to not get killed. With this fight, you can literally stand in one spot, put the controller down, and wait for Roo to finish his round of hopscotch, and you'll be in no danger whatsoever. Again, I tried to be soft on this fight because it is the first fight in the game, but even with that in mind, I don't think it's particularly stellar. Almost every other game in the series proves they can be a lot more creative with their first boss fights while still being easy, and Ripperoo just doesn't do that. So I'm gonna be honest, I don't think a huge amount of fights in Crash are genuinely bad, and the ones that I think are, I've already gotten out of the way. But there are a large number that are just strictly okay. These are mostly the ones that all follow a similar structure of dodge attacks while you wait for an opening, strike the opponent at that moment, rinse and repeat 2 more times. It's not a bad formula, but it's a very uninteresting one that the series uses a lot, and it's kinda hard to rank a lot of the middle of this list as a result, because I end up having to weigh heavily on other factors of the fights themselves, mostly coming down to minor nitpicks. I chose to explain this here because there's really not a lot to say about Evil Crunch from Entrance. He has to be one of the least impressive fights that uses this formula, and a lot of my grievances with Ripperoo and Crash 2 also kind of apply here, namely the fact that you really don't have to do anything outside of blindly mash the shoot button to not only clear any nitro in your path, but also to hit Crunch. For the sake of brevity, I won't go into more detail. This is another example of a first boss fight that could have been much more creative than it was.
And it's wet! Too wet!
I know I said I tried to be softer on first bosses, and then proceeded to list 3 of them near the bottom all in a row, but I swear there are others that I genuinely find good and placed way higher on my list. Dingo Down the Huge Adventure is not one of those fights, though. The standard formula is kinda mixed up here since the fight is underwater, making it kinda awkward to dodge the torpedoes, falling stalactites, and occasional sharks, but otherwise this fight really doesn't have a lot going for it. The choice of locale for this fight is so weird though. Like, who at Vicarious Visions looked at Dingodile, the pyromaniac who tried blasting you with a flamethrower in his last outing as a boss, and decided, yeah, let's put this guy underwater. That makes sense. At least his swim trunks are snazzy.
Why is everything all tiny?
I really don't have a lot to say about Huge Adventure Tiny. It's a watered-down version of his Crash 3 fight, and that's about it, really. There's nothing inherently bad about it, but I kinda just had to throw it somewhere, so here you go.
To lay boom down big.
It's probably odd to some people that I have Papu Papu ranked so high, especially because he's so laughably easy that both the Japanese version of Crash 1 and the Insane Trilogy buffed his health to 5 hit points instead of 3. But remember how I said I wanted to be softer towards the first bosses in each game? Well, Papu Papu is the first boss fight in the entire series, and while I by no means think that he's a challenging boss fight whatsoever, I do think he does a very solid job of introducing the player to how boss fights generally are. The way he only takes damage from jumping on him shows how most bosses have a specific way they need to be attacked. The flashing effect when he's invincible establishes how you'll usually need to find a specific opening in which to strike. I also really like that the window to attack Papu is very generous. You can choose to play it completely safe and wait for him to swing his staff and leave himself vulnerable, or you can try and strike him in the middle of his spinning sweep if you want to opt for a riskier but quicker course of action. I also think the general setup and story-based reason for this fight are uniquely charming. Every other boss in the original trilogy is some mutated animal or evil scientist that has a bone to pick with Crash. Papu isn't even associated with Cortex, he's just mad because you ransacked his village and committed breaking and entering in the middle of his beauty sleep. I can vibe with that honestly. I'd be mad too if I was sleeping and some orange rat showed up in my hut and proceeded to jump on my head. So yeah, Papu isn't a spectacular boss fight overall, hence why he's still rather low on this list, but I can respect that he does a solid job of setting the precedent for future fights while still feeling a fair bit unique.
What? No lizards!
The Komodo Bros are a step up from Ripperoo. I realize that's about as low of a bar as if you asked Flat Stanley to play Limbo, but I can respect this fight adding a bit more to the standard pattern than other bosses. Namely the fact that Komodo Joe doesn't follow the exact same trajectory every time and actually moves depending on where he initially stopped and from what direction you hit him into Komodo Mo. I also like that Mo's scimitar throwing attack becomes longer in the second phase, and in the third phase he literally throws them while Joe is spinning. It's still not a particularly large amount to write home about, and the fight is still very basic, but hey, they tried. Also, for some reason, Naughty Dog thought that this fight was challenging enough that not only is it the only fight in the PS1 version of Crash 2 where you can bring Aku Aku into it, you're actually given a mask at the start. Vicarious Visions didn't feel the same way and simply told us all to be better.
Crunchize me, Karen!
I'd say that there are worse final bosses than Crunch Time and Wrath of Cortex, but that's an even lower bar than the last one. This fight isn't nearly as anticlimactic as Cortex is in Crash 2, but considering how much of a threat Crunch is set up to be, I kind of expect more out of the final showdown with him than Crunch steps on some buttons and you have to dodge the attacks and then shoot him with your bazooka. By the way, they don't even tell you that you have to use the bazooka, you have to figure that part out on your own. The fight is actually pretty hard, but I don't think it's in a way that's particularly fair. The sheer amount of attacks you have to dodge, along with the awful depth perception, means you oftentimes will just get blindsided by a stray meteor or frozen by an ice cube, only to then get struck by one of the other attacks that at that point you can do nothing about. I do think it's neat that they implement all 4 of the elemental masks into this fight, but they don't really do more than pop in and do a little dance and then disappear. Nor do they really explain how they're showing up after you spend the whole game sealing them away. I kinda just expect more out of a final boss than this one delivers, but at least Crunch isn't flying away from you on a jetpack, am I right?
Let's blue this!
Speaking of underwhelming final bosses, Entropy and Entrance is just his Crash 3 fight, but worse. It follows the same basic structure of the former, but with 2 key differences that make it far more annoying. The first is just how long the fight is. Initially, it looks like he's gonna go down in a very quick and easy 3 hits, but once you land that last one, he regenerates his health and takes you to a new location where you have to hit him 3 more times. And he does this twice. You have to hit this blue bastard 9 times across 3 phases, with each phase being longer than the previous one, and if you die at any point in this fight, you have to start the whole thing over. Which brings me into the other issue I have with this fight. The pattern in which Entropy fires his shots is consistent in the first 2 phases, but in the third phase, it's random. I don't think RNG is inherently bad from a design perspective, but when you're in a final boss where you have an incredibly scarce room to work with, and a single error can result in a death that takes you to the beginning of the fight, it becomes a massive issue. I do think there's a bigger feeling of finality to this fight than Crunch Time, mainly just with the general atmosphere and structure of the fight. I do really like that he takes you to the 3 separate locales that the platforming levels of the game take place in, but from a gameplay perspective, this fight can become very frustrating, very fast.
Jafar!
And on that note, Entropy's original fight in Crash 3 is equally underwhelming, but at the very least he's not the final boss, and it doesn't take you 3 phases to actually finish him off. There's actually a fair bit about this fight that I enjoy. The changing of the environment after each hit, starting what seems to be the core of the Time Twister itself, and then transitioning into various time periods, is a nice reflection of Entropy himself as the master of time. I like that they mix some platforming into the formula as well by making you run to Entropy when he's vulnerable, even having different floor layouts while doing so. Even with all that though, I think this fight is a bit too formulaic, especially since the other fights in Crash 3 I felt did a solid job of trying to mix things up a bit more, which we'll get to later down the list. It also doesn't help that Entropy is, as previously stated, played out to be a pretty massive threat, and yet this is all we really see of him. And thus, his legacy of simply being average at best in terms of boss fights began. When making this list, I had a particularly hard time figuring out how I felt about the fight with Cortex in Huge Adventure. As a final boss fight, I do find it to be relatively underwhelming, but in general, I don't think it's outright bad or subpar in the same way I feel about Crash 2 Cortex, Crunch Time, or Entrance Entropy. There's a lot about this fight that doesn't really make sense, like how has Crash managed to unshrink himself? But at the same time, there's a lot about the Huge Adventure as a whole that just doesn't make sense, so whatever, I guess. As an actual fight, while it does follow the standard dodge the attacks 3 times formula, it does mix things up in that you aren't actually hitting Cortex yourself. Rather, you're baiting him into damaging his own planetary minimizer by tricking him into hitting the machines. Colored gems? Alright then. I can appreciate the bait and punish element of this fight, even if it's not entirely original or a standout.
For his neutral special, he wields a gun.
I actually really like the dynamic of Pinstripe's fight in Crash 1. I like the fact that they give you the ability to hide behind the furniture to not get shot by a shockingly realistic gun. And I also like that in the first 3 hits there isn't a blatantly defined opening on when you're supposed to strike them. You could Leroy Jenkins this fight if you really wanted to, and I think that's pretty cool. And then the second half of the fight happens. Once you whittle Pinstripe down to his last 3 hit points, the fight transforms into the standard waiting game as you're no longer able to freely hit him whenever you want. You have to wait for his gun to jam before he actually becomes vulnerable. And I get that they probably did that so you can't just wail on him endlessly, but it ends up just making this one of the long lists of distinctly average fights in the series. But I will commend him on being smart enough to bring a gun to a spinning rodent fight? What?
Sorry, but we don't serve minors. Dig, nabbit.
Koala Kong mixes up the formula by having 4 hit points instead of 3. In all seriousness though, there are a few things in this fight that I do think add a small degree of depth to it. Kong's random attack timing at the end of each phase means you can't just know when specifically he's going to throw the last piece of coal at you. The minecarts acting as shields for him also means you can't just blindly spin the coal back at him without properly timing it. The TNTs in the first 2 phases are trivial, but once you get into the second half of the fight and they start dropping from the ceiling during the portion where Kong throws the last piece of coal at you, it can become a bit more of a headache, having to contend with the TNT, the impending giant rock headed your way, and finding an opening to hit the coal back at him while trying to be not too fast so you hit a minecart instead, but also not so slow that you lose your opening. It's just the little things like that, you know? Not Kong though, he's not a little thing.
It burns!
We're reaching the end of the wave of wait it out and hit them 3 times boss fights, and while there are still some later down the list, I think they have enough positives going for them that they avoid being lumped among the boss fights that are just really average. In the case of Crashes to Ashes, I think it's cool that you have to actually chase Crunch down when he becomes vulnerable, instead of simply standing in place to be hit. I also like how you can't just blindly hold the attack button down when trying to hit him, since using the hose actually slows you down, so you have to time your attack properly. I do have some grievances with this fight, namely that the trajectory of the fire rocks he throws at you, whether or not they break in the 3rd phase, and the way the ones he drops move in the 3rd phase, are all random and can sometimes move in patterns that make them extremely obnoxious to avoid. But other than that, this is a pretty serviceable fight with enough of a shake-up to the basic formula to make it stand out at least a little bit.
Squidward, I used your clarinet to unclog my toilet.
There's a very funny passage on TV Tropes that describes drain damage as insanely hard, and while I do think that's hyperbolic, to say the least, I'd be lying if I said it didn't give me a fair bit of grief as a kid. The hitboxes on Crunch's discount entropy lasers are definitely misleading as hell. The depth perception is not the kindest in this fight, but I feel like it's overall pretty manageable, especially when slide jumping is brought into the mix. I'm not even sure what this bubble earthquake attack is supposed to do. I'm convinced that's never killed anyone ever, and I'm chalking up anyone stating otherwise to the Mandela effect. From a design perspective, I actually think drain damage is pretty cool. It's the first fight in the series to make heavy use of point A to point B platforming. It basically takes what Entropy and 3 did and makes it the whole fight. I think having to weave through boss attacks to reach them is a lot more interesting than simply waiting their attacks out, so this gives the fight a lot of points in my eyes. The troubling depth perception and misleading hitboxes on the attacks are detrimental though, even if I think how hard the fight actually is blown way out of proportion.
I don't know whether to have sex with you or kill you!
Uka Uka in Twinsanity feels like one of those fights that's just kinda there. I do think it's odd that he even felt the need to create an ice body when simply staying in his mask form would have made him a pain in the ass to hit, but this is a running trend for his solo boss fights, so maybe he needs to channel his energy through a makeshift body to be effective. Or he's an idiot. In regards to the fight itself, I do like that, much like drain damage, it has you weave through and avoid his attacks instead of doing the standard waiting for an opening, though it doesn't go about it in the same way. You make the opening yourself by having Cortex activate switches that open up flame vents to melt Uka Uka with. I think it's a really good use of the team-up mechanic in Twinsanity, while also being an engaging fight where you're trying to avoid getting hit, while also not just waiting the fight out. I don't really have too much else to say about this fight. It's simple but effective. Yay! As far as first bosses go, the joint fight between Cortex and the Mecha Bandicoot in Twinsanity is a pretty solid one, even if it's not an absolute standout. Much of this fight is very reminiscent of previous fights in the series, but I think one of Twinsanity's more unspoken charms is its ability to pay homage to the past while still feeling fresh. And I think this fight does that pretty well. The Cortex section is very reminiscent of his fight in Crash 1, and the Mecha Bandicoot is somewhat reminiscent of a fight with Engine, but both still manage to feel distinct enough that they don't feel tired or boring. Another point I'd like to make is that it's kinda cool to have Cortex be the first boss fight in the game, when in other games he's almost always the final boss. That, on top of this fight happening in the first level, and the game heavily advertising the fact that you team up with him, all I think helped lay heavily into the surprise factor this fight held the first time I ran into it. It's nothing to write home about, but I like it.
All I said was there's evil afoot.
Does Evil Coco from Entrance follow the standard boss formula? Yes. Is he probably ranked too high? Yes. Do I really like this fight anyway? Yes. I think it's really just the atmosphere that makes it stand out for me. The background music really plays into the frantic feeling since, unlike the very similarly structured Dingodile fight from the Huge Adventure, Coco is constantly barraging you with attacks, and the crammed space can make dodging everything she throws at you somewhat of a challenge. This fight is pretty standard overall, but the chaotic feeling makes me like it a bit more than normal and keeps it from being boring. Also, I love this boss icon. I hope whoever made this sprite got a raise. There's an alternate universe where I got off my ass and started making this video when I first thought of it months ago. In some ways though, I'm glad I didn't, because if I had made this any sooner, Rumble in the Rocks would be near the bottom. For those unsavvy with the TWAC speedrunning experience, this fight is quite notorious for being a very easy place to lose a lot of time. Compounded with childhood memories of this being a very difficult boss the first time I played it, I had very little positive things to say about it. Once I took a step back and really examined this fight more, however, I realized that there's actually quite a lot about it that I think is pretty neat. As I've stated for many fights in this video, I massively respect that it eschews the standard formula in favor of something different. Having a boss fight in the Atmosphere, where you and Crunch are both rolling around, competing with each other to successfully control every rock in the arena, is honestly a really cool concept for a fight when you think about it. Where this fight really falls flat is in its execution. Prior to this, the only experience you have with the Atmosphere up to this point is in the level Bamboozled, so you'll likely find controlling it to be very awkward at this point in the game. Additionally, much like Drain Damage, depth perception is not on your side here. I also think the fight is a bit too difficult for a first boss. The aforementioned issues, on top of Crunch's AI being able to control his own ball with pinpoint precision, make this fight far more challenging than any early game boss really should be, and for all the wrong reasons too. Overall, this fight is a wonderful idea that honestly just needed some more polish. Rock polish, if you will. God, I'm sorry, that was so horrible.
Lovely memes!
How can one even evaluate a boss fight as idiosyncratic as a hole in space, so brilliant and yet so unfulfilling? I think the fact that this is the first Crash 4 boss fight I'm talking about, and it's this high up, speaks volumes to just how much Toys for Bob really raised the bar in terms of quality fights. I also think that the fact that this is the highest ranking entropy boss fight speaks volumes to just how underwhelming his battles consistently are. Honestly, this was a really hard fight to rank. Hell, it barely qualifies as a fight considering you only spend about the last 10% of it actually fighting anyone, with the previous 90% traveling to your destination and also observing the dev's magnificently effective use of a horrendously overused meme. I really don't know what else I can say. We all know this fight builds up to something huge and then ends up being a pretty big letdown. It's one of the most common criticisms I see about Crash 4. I feel like it's blatantly obvious that this was supposed to be much longer and epic, maybe even with the sections where you play as the other characters besides Crash and Coco, but for whatever reason we were left with a long trek to a 2-hit moment boss fight that's over as soon as it begins. So with all that in mind, why is this in the middle of the list and not near the bottom? Well, in spite of all of its weaknesses, A Hole in Space absolutely nails something that many of the fights ranked below it were lacking in. And that something is presentation! This fight knocks it out of the park in terms of spectacle, with the initial rail grind through the distorted space-time continuum followed by the huge trek to reach the entropies. I also really love how the fight makes use of all 4 quantum masks, and in the order that you get them no less, starting with Lonnie Loli on the rail grind, traversing the moving platforms with Akano and Kapunawa, and then finally fighting the entropies themselves with Ika Ika. This fight really has all the makings of a fantastic final boss, even though it doesn't live up to it and it's not the final boss. But they sure do a good job of tricking you into thinking it might be. As a penultimate boss fight, Brio in Crash 1 manages to shake up the formula set by the previous 4 fights pretty well. First off, look at that health bar. It's huge! I do think it's interesting how for the first part of this fight, you aren't even fighting Brio himself, but rather these weird balls of goop he sends after you. Though I am glad that in the Insane Trilogy version, they established that destroying them splashes their residue back at him. It didn't really make sense why that did damage to him in the original. I guess destroying his little blob monsters just really hurt his feelings or something. The real crazy part of this fight is when you finally get him down to his last 3 health bars and you're just sitting there like, okay, he's just gonna send out a few more blobs, I guess. Why is he drinking it? That can't be healthy.
Oh my goodness!
This was the first boss fight that had a transition in the middle of the fight, a concept that they didn't really utilize again until 2 games later with Engine. This fight is the perfect balance of challenge and uniqueness on top of pulling off a really creepy atmosphere.
They're the same!
Trouble Brewing from Crash 4 is extremely derivative of the Brio fight in Crash 1 that I just talked about, right down to having literally the exact same structure. The 2 fights may as well be tied, because I think they both excel in one field and falter in the other. Crash 1 Brio definitely wins in the presentation department, but I think in terms of actual gameplay, I slightly prefer Trouble Brewing. The implementation of Akano in this fight is really cool. It serves to be more effective than simply giving the dude a migraine by digging your foot into his cranium. Really though, the biggest sin this fight is guilty of is that once you finish it, Brio uses his cloaca to create the single worst part of Crash 4, the inverted levels. Automatically worse than Crash 2 Cortex, -5 out of 10. What the fuck? Ripperoo being absolutely insane is a perfect reflection of how insane Naughty Dog had to be to think the difficulty spike going to this fight from Papu Papu was reasonable. There is a lot more timing involved, not just compared to Papu, but also to every other boss fight in the game, namely with having to have Ripperoo's hopping pattern line up with the way the big TNTs are moving. Quick side note, is anyone else sad that this is the only time that we ever see big TNTs? I do like that this fight takes a lot more effort than many others in the series, but for how early in the game it is, I could see this potentially being a big roadblock for newer players. Still, I do think it's a standout among most of the other fights in Crash 1.
Almost. Exactly as if they're alive.
The Totem God in Twinsanity, or Tikimon as he is apparently named, is definitely a fight that gets carried by spectacle more so than the fight itself. From a gameplay perspective, I do think that it's cool that it makes use of the team-up mechanic, being the first fight where Crash and Cortex work together. Outside of that, though, it's pretty bland. But what really makes me love this fight is not the quality of the gameplay itself, but like I said, the spectacle and the atmosphere. This is, again, the first time that Crash and Cortex team up to take down a boss. The fight very much takes advantage of that. I also love how Tikimon isn't some evolved animal or evil scientist. He's one of the various Totem God statues littered across Insanity Island, brought to life by the game's real antagonists, the Evil Twins. At this point, we were 7 games into the series, if counting only platformers, and the last time we fought a boss who wasn't part of one of the 2 aforementioned categories was Papu Papu all the way back in Crash 1. It's that kind of similar yet distinct feeling that I mentioned before that gives Twinsanity a lot of its charm. The background song just adds to the atmosphere and helps create what is in my opinion a pretty solid second boss fight in the game. It's just a damn shame that in the speedrun we do this instead of fighting them. At a glance, there's not really that much to Tiny's boss fight in Crash 3, and maybe because of that it could strike one as an odd pick for the top 20. However, there's a lot about this fight I like beyond just the spectacle. Let's get that out of the way first. Being set in a gladiator arena with lions and a cheering crowd is just a perfect fit for Tiny. The music does a lot for adding the appeal to this fight. I also think that as a first boss fight, this is a rather significant step up in quality compared to both of its predecessors. Whereas Papu Papu was painfully easy, even as the first fight in the series, and Ripperoo was just incredibly boring and effortless, Tiny actually manages to provide a decent challenge. Especially during the part between phases where he sends hordes of lions at you. This can be very tricky if you're not comfortable with not only weaving through obstacles, but also with how the timer on the spin mechanic works. It's not so easy that you can just stroll through it, but also not so hard that it can't be properly learned with just a little bit of experience. It strikes a good balance for how early it is, and I think that's worth putting a lot of value into. The highest ranking Wrath of Cortex fight on the list, Atmospheric Pressure, is one of the 2 fights I like to call Discount Crash 3 Engine, because that's what this fight is. It's extremely similar in structure, with you attacking certain parts of Crunch's body as he attacks you, with each attack gradually disappearing the further along the fight gets. Hell, it's even the 4th boss fight in the game. All of this doesn't make the fight bad on its own, but it does reek of being extremely derivative of a prior game, which is really just an issue with TWAC as a whole. My only real criticism with the fight is that, at least from my own experience, it's not really that clear as to where you're supposed to attack. You're meant to hit the part of the body that he's using at that moment, and that's signified by Aku Aku surrounding that area. But I don't know, that always seemed a bit cryptic to me. If not for that, I'd maybe put this a bit higher, but either way, it sits just outside of the boss fights that I consider to be a bit more exceptional. And just before we get into that group of more exceptional bosses, let's briefly talk about the other Discount Crash 3 engine. I give this one more of a pass because it actually is engine, and Huge Adventure as a game is just intentionally cut and paste for the most part anyway. This fight also has a bit more of a frantic pacing to it compared to the slower pace of Atmospheric Pressure, and that I think makes it feel a bit more exciting. However, I do think some of his attacks, as well as the movement of Engine himself, are a bit too fast and make it hard not only to avoid the hits, but also to hit him back. It's abnormally difficult for the second boss in the game, but overall not too offensive, and definitely one of the less infuriating parts of the Huge Adventure, funnily enough.
Feel the wrath of Cortex!
So, I initially ranked 4th times the charm, the first fight with Cortex in Crash 4, very high on this list, and then as I was writing out this script, I looked it over again and tried thinking why exactly I did that. I mean, it's a neat fight for sure. I think it's cool that Cortex is in the midpoint fight of the game, and at this point the game has you believing that'd be the only time you fight him. But I'm not really sure what else made me have it so high at first. Design-wise, I think it's a cool use of Kapunawa, where you're faced with such an onslaught of attacks that you just have to slow down time to survive. Usually. But I don't really think that's enough to put it above so many of the other fights I have yet to talk about. I'm really stumped on this one. By no means is this a bad fight. It's actually quite great, and I'm really at a loss as to why I initially rated it so much higher. Still, just outside of the top 15 isn't anything to scoff at.
Number 15.
I feel like boss fights in Crash 2 kind of get a bad rap, and that's not totally unfounded. But I do think one fight definitely doesn't get the appreciation it deserves, and that's Tiny. Every boss in Crash up to this point is one that, even if they're big, has some physical weakness, and I think that's what I like about this fight. There is no way for you to directly damage Tiny. There's no waiting for an opening, just a game of cat and mouse until you trick him into falling so hard that his teeth retract. I don't think there's anything too amazing about this fight, but I do think it's cool that Tiny is a boss that's so physically imposing that you can't overpower him, and your only choice is to outsmart him. Granted, that's not the hardest thing in the world, but it's a neat dynamic that hadn't really been seen in a boss fight up to this point. So we're finally at the boss fights that I think have something about them that really stick out. Boss fights that I'd say are definitely pretty great. So why is Entrance all the way up here? Well, if this fight was only the first part, it would be much lower. The first half of the Entrance boss fight is yet another boss fight that follows the formula of dodge his attacks, wait for him to become vulnerable, and hit him. Not terrible, but pretty played out by now, and pretty disappointing for what's set up to be the final boss. No, what really makes Entrance stand out is the second half of this fight. We finally take out his last health point, and instead of just falling over defeated, this dude just turns into MODOK, and we transition to a second phase, and holy hell, this phase is sick. There's no set patterns to dodge until there's an opening. This is free movement with the copter pack while you try to force Entrance into the lava pit below Fake Crash so you can rain molten hot magma down on top of him. Can we talk about that for a second? One thing that goes on for the entirety of this game is that every time you free someone from Entrance's hypnotic spell, they proceed to help you for the rest of the game. With Crunch and Coco, it's simple enough. They become playable characters for their own sets of levels, but even Fake Crash helps you out by being the person who actually damages Entrance in this phase of the fight. I love that small little detail, the fact that Fake Crash also allies with you and helps you take the bad guys down. Even if it's just one small part, that's such a neat thing that really makes me love this fight even more. That aside, I also love how Entrance has a huge plethora of different attacks to throw at you. There's a genuinely damaging attack where he throws SpaghettiOs at you, but also two slow-moving orbs that have one of two disorienting effects. Either your screen is filled with copies of yourself, making it harder to tell where you are, or your controls get flipped. I also like how Entrance doesn't have a set pattern in which he launches these attacks at you. He'll always retaliate after getting hit, but if you take too long to hit him again, he'll attack you again anyway. And the time it takes varies. It punishes you for dawdling, but also isn't something that can be easily predicted. It keeps you on your toes, and I really like that about this fight. The first half of this fight isn't anything special, but the second half more than makes up for it. It definitely earns its spot within the top 15, and is one of the many things that makes me feel like Entrance is an absurdly underappreciated game in the series. But that's a topic for another video.
Holy crap, Louis!
Is this one a hot take? I feel like this one's gonna be a hot take, but yeah, I actually really like the mini-boss fight with Luis at the end of Jetboard Jetty in Crash 4. And yes, a mini-boss still counts as a boss. I actually didn't like this fight when the game first came out. I found it to be very annoying because I didn't really understand how the jet were controlled. And even though I understand it now, it's still a bit awkward due to how small the arena is. But after I thought about it more, I actually think there's a lot about this fight that's pretty cool. The concept of a mini-boss at the end of a level is something that had never been used at any point before this. And I kinda wish Crash 4 used it a bit more because it's actually really awesome. I think it would have been interesting if the last levels in the hubs between boss fights had mini-bosses like this, instead of it just being a one-time thing. Beyond just that though, I really like the way that this boss fight is even approached, with how you have to position yourself in a way that baits the pirate rats into crashing into Luis's tentacles. Kinda similar to the cat and mouse style of Tiny's Crash 2 fight, but you aren't really baiting Luis herself, more so her flunkies into hitting her by mistake. The fight is definitely not perfect. Like I said, the arena is pretty claustrophobic, and the jetboard in this game has such a wide turning arc that can make this fight pretty difficult to actually get a feel for. But I do really like what they went for here. It's a cool concept. I'm still really glad we found a skip for it in the speedrun though.
This time I shall reign triumphant!
I'm gonna be honest, 99% of the reason this fight is so high up is the atmosphere. Design-wise, the final boss with Cortex in Crash 1 is alright. Nothing really to write home about, though I guess having to reflect the green shots back at him is pretty neat. But what really sells this fight for me is just everything else. The tone, the ominous music, the burning castle in the background, it really feels like a last showdown with the dude you've been traveling across multiple islands to confront, and is just set up so perfectly as a finale for the game. It really dips super hard into that darker, more ambient tone that Crash 1 has compared to its sequels, and honestly, I'm completely about it. I don't really have too much to say about the fight otherwise, funnily enough, despite how high I have it ranked. It's really just the atmosphere and that tone as a final boss for the game that sells it hard.
I have no idea what you just said.
If we want to talk about atmosphere though, I don't think any fight in the series nails that to the same degree that Dingo Dial and Twinsanity does. The song here especially is the perfect fit for a battle taking place in the deepest, hottest part of the boiler room at the Academy of Evil, and really feeds into Dingo's pyromaniac personality as well. It really helps elevate the boss fight to be incredible when otherwise I just think it's pretty great. As far as design goes, I do think it's a step up from others of its sort. Yes, there's a lot of waiting on attacks and finding an opening, but it also has elements of baiting Dingo into said opening by tricking him into revealing a button that puts out the fire shield around him. That, on top of the boss fight being genuinely challenging, is enough that I'd still have this fight in the upper half regardless. But the tone the music sets is just so perfect and so fitting that it elevates it into nearly top 10 status. I know a lot of people will rate this fight even higher, and I can't even blame them. There's just a few other fights that stick out a bit more to me.
And you're wearing a mask.
The Past Unmasked is, for all intents and purposes, Crunch Time from Wrath of Cortex, but done well. It has the same basic premise where the enemy in question is using all 4 of the game's masks against you, but unlike Wrath of Cortex, where all Crunch does is press buttons that cause each mask to somehow be free from the imprisonment you lock them back in by this point, Crash 4 is a lot more clever about it. Unlike the Elementals, the Quantum Masks are your allies in this game, which means at the beginning of this fight, Cortex takes them from you and uses the powers you've been using throughout the entire game against you. I like how this is a shakeup of not just previous games or the previous levels in this game where you use the masks, but also the previous boss fights. Every fight in Crash 4 up to this point has you using one of the Quantum Masks to take them down, including the previous boss fight where you used all 4. The Past Unmasked is a fantastic contrast to this, since now you're powerless with none of the masks at your disposal, and you have to take Cortex down solely with the skills Crash and Coco have by themselves. I also think the use of each Quantum Mask's power is pretty well done. Lonnie Loli and Ika Ika in particular are great, and while Kapunawa and Akano are a bit less so, I think there's only so much you can do with their powers, and I think the devs were as creative as they could be. All in all, a wonderful final boss and a wonderful start to our top 10.
Run for your life!
I wasn't even sure if I should have counted this as a boss fight, but Megamix might be the only thing about the huge adventure that I think is genuinely awesome, so I felt like I just had to mention him here. This might seem like an extremely odd choice for a top 10 slot, but stay with me for a second. First off, I think every boss in the game accidentally fusing into this giant freakish monster, which the game actually just calls Monster, is pretty cool. But let's go back to something I said about Crash 2 Tiny, how I thought it was awesome that there was a boss that you couldn't really beat with brute force and you had to outwit him in order to win the fight. That's taken to the extreme with Megamix. This is a boss so huge, so imposing, so menacing that you cannot win this fight. There is no victory to be had. Your only hope for survival is to run like hell and hope it doesn't catch you. And you know, that's just kinda rad. Every other boss in the series has some weakness, something exploitable about them. There's no weakness to exploit on Megamix. You really just have to escape with your life. It's just so far removed from anything else in the series that I can't help but love it. If you don't want to consider this a boss fight, I don't blame you. It's really more of a glorified chase sequence. But it is the final challenge of the game, and it has the feel of a boss fight even though it isn't actually a fight, so I thought it deserves some mention.
Break out the butter. I'm gonna make toast.
Dingo Dial's introductory boss fight in Crash 3 might not have the same amount of atmosphere and spectacle that his Twin Sanity fight has, but it still does quite well in that department, and it more than makes up for anything it lacks by being one of the absolute best designed fights in the entire series. Going past the first half of each phase, where you just have to dodge the fireballs he launches into the air, the second part is the absolute pinnacle of bait and punish style Crash bosses. You don't wait for an opening in this fight, you make the opening by tricking Dingo Dial into destroying the crystal shield surrounding him. That is so awesome and a major improvement from every boss fight that precedes it in the trilogy. I feel like while Tiny was definitely a better first boss than either of his predecessors, Dingo Dial is the fight where you realize just how much Naughty Dog stepped up their game with boss design in Crash 3 compared to Crash 1 and 2. This fight is just such a massive jump in quality that I really feel like it's one of the pinnacles of the series as a whole. It's just that good.
To me, you'll always be a little verm.
A lot of boss fights in Crash manage to hit all of the right story beats, and a lot of other fights are really well done from a design perspective, but Madame Amberly manages to accomplish both. Even in the extremely limited time Twin Sanity has to do so, the Academy of Evil is set up to be Cortex's origins of sorts. It's where he learned how to be an evil doctor. From the very first moments Madame Amberly is on screen, the two's relationship is established. You can see the absolute terror in Cortex's face, the way his voice pitches up tremendously just trying to stand up for himself. He is terrified of this woman. And that makes it all the more cathartic when you actually take her down in a fight. It's a very subtle piece of Cortex's character arc throughout the entire game, but I love it all the same. As an actual boss battle, the fight is pretty awesome. The way you move is extremely important, as you're trying to not get trapped between two of the organ pipes she opens up, and I really like that. It's a challenging, honestly even difficult fight. The only thing that sucks about it is how far back you get sent if you do die in it, and the fact that you're forced to watch the cutscene before it again. It's not unfair, it does require a good bit of effort on the player's part, and is rewarding to boot. Quick side note, can we talk about how we literally just killed this woman at the end of the fight? Like, I'm pretty sure Cortex just straight up murdered her.
Playtime is over!
As the resident dude that's completely obsessed with Twinsanity, you'd think I have nothing but endless praise for this boss fight that I see so many people prop up as perfect, and it is clocking in at just outside the top 5 on this list, but you may be shocked to hear that I've actually gone back and forth on how good of a final boss fight I think the evil twins actually are. With time though, my opinion has definitely shifted to be more overwhelmingly positive than negative, and my criticisms of the fight are few and far between. As a kid, I used to hate the fact that you don't actually play as Crash on foot in this fight. It seems like such an odd choice for a Crash Bandicoot game of all things, but I eventually came to really appreciate that decision for a number of reasons. For one, the entire final level before this, and Agony, is a solo Crash level, and it's a long one, so I think it was fair for him to not take the spotlight in the showdown when he had the entire last level all to himself. Second, this boss fight, together with the preceding level, is a great culmination of everything you'd seen in the game up to this point. You open the fight with Nina in the first phase, and then transition to Cortex in the second phase. On that note, I want to really talk about Cortex both in the fight itself and in the cutscene that plays right before it. For the entire game up to this point, Cortex has been the punching bag, the butt monkey. He's been used and abused in more ways than can ever be counted, and you really get a glimpse of how sensitive he really is. But right here, when all bets are off, Cortex puts his foot down and stands up for himself. You see it in the final moments of the cutscene, and you see it in the transition to his part of the fight, where he, cowering in fear, realizes that he can fight back, and puts himself between the twins and Nina. It's such a perfect culmination in Cortex's character growth throughout the game, and it's such a good snapshot of what makes Twinsanity as a whole so good, and what makes its version of Cortex and Lex Lang's portrayal of him the best that's ever been done. And if that wasn't enough, the cherry on top of this fight is the final phase, when Crash finally swoops in after running off at the start, piloting the Mecha Bandicoot. It's such a phenomenal bookend to the beginning of the game, being able to control the first boss to take down the final boss, and oh god, it's all so good! Man, I really should make a video on why Twinsanity is such a beautiful, flawed masterpiece. Put that on the list.
Crash Bandicoot for the last time. Give the crystals to me.
There are plenty of great final bosses in the series, but out of all of them, I still think Cortex's fight at the end of Crash 3 stands out the most. Everything about this fight screams finale. You can tell that Naughty Dog went in knowing that this was the end of, at the very least, their run with the series, and they pulled out all stops in the presentation. The setup of a dual final showdown between not only Crash and Cortex, but also Aku Aku and Uka Uka is so fantastic, and the perfect payoff to what the game had been building up to for its entirety. Even better is that the fight takes place in what appears to be the central core of the Time Twister machine. The music only adds to the appeal, being a much more epic version of Cortex's theme from the previous two games. The fight just truly feels like the end of a saga, and it shows. Even though the Crash series would go on for many years to come, for better or worse, it could have ended right here and it would have been a satisfying conclusion. As far as it goes as an actual fight, it's pretty standard fare. I do like the dynamic of having to stay out of the crossfire of Aku Aku and Uka Uka while simultaneously dodging Cortex's attacks, but ultimately it's the presentation of the fight that carries it into the top 5, although the fight itself certainly isn't bad. Way back at the beginning of this list, I mentioned how I felt like Engine was the boss who consistently had the most amazing battles across the series. His debut fight in Crash 2 is one such example. It's the biggest standout fight in Crash 2, and in my opinion it set the bar for what a good boss fight in the series should be. This was the first fight that completely eschewed the standard formula. There's no specific attack pattern that you have to wait out before you can attack. Sure, there are patterns, but it's all for the most part an open canvas. You can attack at virtually any point due to how often Engine makes himself vulnerable. There are attacks to dodge, but you can even strike them while said attacks are happening. If you're particularly fast enough and smart with your timing, you can even get 2 hit points off them at once. In a series that overall has very simple, straightforward boss fights, Engine is a fight with an incredible amount of depth, while at the same time not being too complicated. It really is the poster child example of what I think every Crash boss should strive to be. I've sung a lot of praises for various final bosses across the series, but first bosses tend to range from okay to rather unimpressive. Toys for Bob really needed a way to show just how much they ramped things up with Crash 4, and I think they more than delivered with Stage Dive. I don't think it's unfair at all to say that this fight is by far the most grandiose first boss in the entire series, if not one of the most grandiose boss fights overall. The spectacle is up to 11. The Guitar Hero-esque vibe established is just so perfect for a character like Engine, who by the way is just raking in the W's by having 2 fights back to back in this top 5. As far as the fight itself goes, it's way crazier than any other first boss. Sure, it ultimately boils down to the same dodge and wait style, but there's so much going on that it keeps the fight from being boring and provides a very strong challenge for the early game, while not being too unfair. This fight really set the stage for just how grand in scale everything in Crash 4 was compared to all previous games in the series. They really knew what would set apart a good first boss from a fantastic first boss, and that was
Presentation!
You're copying me!
Be completely honest, on a list of the best fights in the series, you did not in a million years expect a fight from one of the GBA games to take the runner-up spot. And yet, Fate Crash from Entrance is one of the best fights to ever grace this series. It's certainly the most unique, and honestly I would argue you can make a genuine case for this actually being number 1. There was, frankly, no better thing they could have done for a fight against Crash's doppelganger. A fight where he mirrors every single move you make and you have to trick him into hurting himself while you avoid that same damage. It's absolutely genius. I did say Dingodile in Crash 3 as the ultimate bait and punish fight, and I stand by that because I don't really think I'd consider this a bait and punish fight. It's not like you're guiding him into mistakenly attacking something or creating an opening. You are literally controlling every move this boss makes. And it's just so clever. It's so creative. It's so insane that one of the best fights to come out of this series is from the very often overlooked GBA titles, but really, there isn't any other fight quite like Fate Crash. It's so perfect, and yet, I still think one other fight just barely edges it out.
Bandicoot!
There are a lot of great boss fights across the entire Crash series, but I don't think there's any fight more incredible than Engine in Crash 3. This fight is unparalleled on every front. It's an even grander version of his fight from Crash 2, which was already in the top 5 of this list. The setup of being in a dogfight in space is just incredible. There's no downtime, no part where things feel boring. It's just constantly frantic, with you completely wailing on him with an endless barrage of attacks, all while Engine does the same to you. There's missiles everywhere, an extremely damaging laser attack that you need to be very careful to avoid. The works. The fact that this is the one boss fight where Coco takes center stage just makes it all the more epic, and I'm totally not biased. And if that wasn't enough, when you take down his first robot, Engine has a second one prepared. This phase of the fight is even more frantic, with an even bigger onslaught of weapons, as well as Engine moving much more quickly from side to side. But I think the biggest standout in this section is the fact that Purah comes in to aid Coco with some extra firepower. It's such a nice little added detail that just elevates this fight to even higher highs than it was already at. And come on, this little scene they included in the Insane Trilogy version of the fight is just adorable. I think it says enough that Engine occupies 3 of the top 5 spots on this list. His fights really are the pinnacle of the series, and his fight in Crash 3 is both him and the series bosses as a whole at their absolute best. It clears in every possible way, and I have no reservations calling it my favorite fight in the entire Crash series. And there we have it. Every boss fight from the Crash platformers ranked from my least favorite to favorite. Thank you all so much for watching. This video was a very long time coming, and I'm glad I was finally able to finish it and get it out of my brain and out there for the internet to see. If you like the video, or you want to disagree with me and tell me how wrong I am, feel free to leave a comment below. I am in no way saying that what I think is gospel, and I'm more than happy to see how other people feel about these boss fights. If you want to see more videos like this, please consider subscribing to the channel. I really want to do more scripted content like this in the future, and I have a lot of ideas to work with. If you want to support me, please consider joining my Patreon. You get a lot of cool perks and updates, and I do this full time, so any support you provide goes a long way in helping me pursue this passion I have for the Crash series and for content creation as a whole. I'll leave the link in the description down below. And finally, if you really like listening to me and you want to watch me live, I do stream almost every day over on Twitch. I mainly do speedruns of many games in the Crash Bandicoot series, so if that piques your interest, be sure to stop by. I'll leave the link to that in the description below as well. Otherwise, I really hope you enjoyed the video, thank you all again for watching, and I'll see you next time.